tonight is the Perry E. and Aleece Gresham Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Bethany College. He teaches courses in world history, European history, and military history. He earned his BA at Bethany College and his MA and Ph.D. at West Virginia University. Please welcome once again Dr. Gary Kappel.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I was telling Aaron, I'm much more concerned about this one than I was last week. For one thing, for many of you, I'm not talking about history, I'm talking about your life. Because many of you lived through the Second World War, either as children or as young adults. I stand in awe and also in trepidation in addressing such a topic. Now, I will tell you this, I grew up in the shadow of World War II. I was born in 1952. My father served in both the Pacific and the European theaters. He and some of his buddies joined up in the spring of '41 to beat the draft. Of course, got caught when the war broke out. And so we shipped to the Pacific and then came back and went into Europe in 1944. His brother Carl was in the 82nd. His brother Jack was in the 1st, the Big Red One. His brother Henry was in the Coast Guard serving European waters, and Uncle Cap built bombers in Southern California. So all of that was on my father's side. My mother's only brother, Uncle Charles, was killed in February 1945. So of course I never knew him, but his picture sat on the piano in our living room all through my growing up years, and now actually is in our living room, where we live now. So while I did not experience it myself, I do feel a certain affinity and closeness to this great struggle. And I have studied it from an academic point of view, and I will try, I hope, to do justice to that and to your experiences. Yes, sir?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe I wasn't speaking loud enough, although that's usually not a problem for somebody with leather lungs like me, that sort of thing. But our topic tonight is the Second World War. You'll recall that we talked about the rise of extremist organizations in the aftermath of the First World War, the disappointment of the diktat, the inability of liberal parliamentary democracy and capitalism to seem to get things going again. After the First World War, and how people were attracted to more radical solutions on both the right and the left, that by the mid-1930s had led to not only the Bolshevik regime in Russia, but also the fascist regime in Italy and the Nazi regime in Germany. The Western democracies, Britain and France specifically, did not feel capable of challenging the rise of these organizations militarily, with some reason. They had failed to, well, the French had a big army, but they were paralyzed by their losses in the First World War, and they would not move without the British, and the British would not move. And so what had been a policy in the 1920s of appeasement from a position of strength over a question or a sense of the diktat went too far and that Germany had legitimate grievances. By the mid-1930s, however, that had begun to change to a policy of submission out of fear. And the fact that, frankly, both Britain and the United States, for that matter, were not ready for any kind of major war. What the appeasers did not understand is that that was precisely the goal of the extremist organizations. We talked about the notion of struggle in both fascist and communist ideology, and the sort of culmination of this was the Munich Agreement in September of 1939. Churchill, you may recall, said, you have been given a choice between dishonor and war. You have chosen dishonor, now you will have war. And within a year, his words came true. As we know, on September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The British had given a guarantee of Poland's frontiers at the end of March 1939. This time, the British did not back down. On September 3rd, having failed to halt the German attack through diplomatic means, the British and the French declared war on Germany. Unfortunately for the Poles, the campaign was probably already over. In the first week of the campaign, we'll talk more about those specific campaigns in a few minutes. But I wanted first to talk about some of the key issues of the Second World War that we will see unfolding in the various campaigns and actions around the world. And indeed, that's the first point. This was a truly global conflict. There was fighting on every continent with the exception of Antarctica, in all of the world's oceans. Unlike World War I, this was truly global. And the casualty figures themselves also indicate this. There had not been a war in Europe since the middle of the 17th century in which more civilians than soldiers were killed. Even the First World War, the great majority of the casualties were of men in uniform, not necessarily from combat itself, but increasingly so. In previous wars, armies almost always suffered far more casualties from disease and neglect and just general screw-ups than in combat itself. In World War I, that begins to change. In World War II, the great majority of the casualties were, in fact, civilians. We don't know how many people died in the Second World War. Traditionally, the figure of 40 million was thrown out for some time. It's been revised upward repeatedly in my lifetime, upwards to 60 or 70 million people. What we do know for sure is that from about the middle of 1943 on, human beings were dying, being killed, at a rate of more than 1 million a month around the planet. And this scale of carnage was something truly new. And, as I say, global in character. And it also leads us to another very depressing aspect of the Second World War, and that is that everyone now became a legitimate target. As we'll see, the mobilization of entire societies for war meant that every man, woman, and child was potentially a contributor to the war effort of his or her country, and hence was now labeled a legitimate target. This had begun in the First World War, but the technology wasn't really up to it. The Germans had used their Zeppelin raids, there had been unrestricted submarine warfare, that sort of thing. But in the Second World War, we really begin to see the fact that everyone is a legitimate target. Now, it didn't happen all at once. The British cabinet debated whether or not to bomb the Reich Wall in 1939, and it was decided not to because it was private property. There were debates in the British cabinet and elsewhere about bombing German cities. By 1942, the British were bombing German cities. Bomber Harris and Bomber Command spoke about dehousing the German population. We're not targeting the Germans themselves, but their houses, yes. And this sort of thing. And of course, by 1945, as you know, even before the advent of atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Curtis LeMay of the 20th Air Force was burning down Japan one city at a time. And indeed more people were killed, for example, in the fire raid of Tokyo in March of 1945 than were killed at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And so one of the more depressing aspects of the Second World War is that there was no longer a distinction between soldier and civilian. And that is, unfortunately, one of the hallmarks of the 20th century. We were all now legitimate targets. And We were legitimate targets of a whole new range of weapons. Another a novel aspect of the Second World War was the enormous impact of science on World War II. In World War I, the Boffins, as the British called them, had been brought into the process to try and address certain specific problems, above all, the trenches, that sort of thing. But there was no pre-war or general organization or mobilization of the scientific community, specifically to develop weapons of war. In the Second World War, from the very beginning, science and technology played an important role. In the 19th century, military men ignored the technological innovations of the civilian economy and had to be forced, in some cases, to adopt new technology, steam power, telegraph, these sorts of things. In the Second World War, it was the reverse. Science was leading the way. When we think of the scientific advancements of the Second World War, or the immediate pre-war years, radar, radio detection and ranging becomes a critical factor. Sonar, improvements of anti-submarine warfare, electronic signaling, proximity fuses, new types of explosives, shape charges, plastique. Then, of course, new types of military aircraft, jet engines, and, of course, missiles, both cruise missiles, or crude version of cruise missile, a V-1, but also a true ballistic missile. Advances in medicine. Penicillin really begins to come into its own as a result of this war. And, of course, the granddaddy of them all, the Manhattan Project, the largest scientific project in human history up to that time. $2 billion in the coin of the day. 10, 15, 20 times that value today. And with this, as I mentioned, the total mobilization of societies for war. And it wasn't simply the material output, but it was also the psychological output. When I was in graduate school, I had a man, Dr. Edward Steele, and Edward Steele came from the mountains of western North Carolina. And he had come out of those mountains only to get involved in the war. As in his late teens, he became a bomber pilot, was shot down, spent a year in the German POW camp. But I remember him talking to me about the fact that here he was, a kid from the boonies, literally the boonies, if you've been to western North Carolina, who all of a sudden was in England, would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, get into his bomber, and head out just as the sun was coming up, over the North Sea, and look out his windshield from the cockpit, and in every direction, above him, below him, on both sides, and behind if he could see it, there were aircraft in the air. And there were tens of thousands of air crew who made those fleets of bombers airworthy every day. And there were hundreds of thousands and multiple hundreds of thousands of people back here in the United States and elsewhere who were building those bombers in the first place. And his point was, he said to me, Gary, you cannot be part of something like that and not be changed by it. Not realize that you are part of this enormous human endeavor. The result of which, of course, was specifically to inflict damage on the enemy. That was in itself a major psychological hurdle. But more importantly was the fact that we are now part of this enormous effort. And I frankly believe that as I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, this notion of the can-do spirit that ultimately, for example, was on the moon, derives directly from that experience, the experience of that generation, of being part of this enormous system that could put you in that cockpit over Germany with a role to play. So all of these are sort of underlying forces at work as we take a look at the specific aspects of the Second World War. Now, the Second World War, of course, did not start as a world war. It was for almost 2 years, actually for more than 2 years, essentially another European war. And the New World and the Pacific were exempt from its destruction. The Asian mainland was not, because the Japanese had already begun. You'll recall from our lecture last time, the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, and that had already claimed the lives of several million people. But as far as World War II traditionally is defined, it began on September the 1st, 1939 in Poland. And from that date until December 7th, 1941, it was still overwhelmingly a European dispute. Now true, both Britain and France, although not for very long, drew upon their, their imperial possessions to combat the Nazis and the Italians. But as a practical matter, World War II, for more than 2 years, was strictly a European affair. And the men who had attempted to head off the war in Britain and in France, at first, while they did indeed declare war on Germany, did continue to find ways to avoid the implications of their decision. As I mentioned, the German campaign in Poland, of course, introduced a whole new form of warfare, which quickly became known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was based on a combination of armored forces on the ground in combination with tactical air power, and designed specifically to not to bludgeon an enemy to death, as had been the offensives of the First World War, but to punch holes in the enemy's defenses and then spread outward in the rear areas and attack the brain rather than the brawn of the enemy forces, disrupt their communications, their control, make it impossible for them to present any kind of organized resistance. Now, traditionally, the view is that the Blitzkrieg went like clockwork. Okay? And as I said, within a week, Polish resistance, as a practical matter, had ceased to have any real coordination to it. Now, it is true that Warsaw itself held out until the last week of September. But as a practical matter, by the end of the first week of September, the Poles had been defeated. So much so that our friend Joseph Stalin, who you'll recall had cut that deal with Hitler just 2 weeks before, very quickly began to fear that maybe the Germans had pulled one over on it, and that as the German forces advanced to the east, they were not going to stop at the line that he and, well, Molotov and von Ribbentrop had drawn, the old Curzon line. And in fact, on the 17th of September, the Russians announced that the Polish government, as a practical matter, had ceased to exist, and that Russian forces would move into eastern Poland to protect the citizens in that area. Now, many of those were, in fact, Belarusians or Ukrainians. We talked a little about the Anglo-Polish War, or Russian-Polish War, that sort of thing. But as a practical matter, the Russians occupied the eastern half of Poland even before Warsaw fell to the Germans. And it certainly was motivated by Stalin's fear that maybe he'd been had. Now, the Germans had no interest in doing this yet, as we'll see, but it was an example of how quickly the Poles collapsed. But, I hear you cry, the British and the French have declared war on Germany. Aren't they attacking the Germans in the west while all of their forces, all 6 of their army divisions, for example, are engaged in the east? Au contraire. As you know, French policy, defense policy in the 1920s and 30s was based purely on defense. The French had spent billions of francs building something called the Maginot Line. Maginot was the defense minister at the time the project got started in the late 20s. But basically the idea was that we will build a wall of fortifications all along the Franco-German border that would be ready to refight World War I. It would be trench warfare, except the trenches now would all be underground, they would be concrete, they would have all the amenities that you could want, and we would sit in our fortifications, and the Germans would obligingly throw themselves into the teeth of this massive defensive fortification. The French, as obviously, had no intention of attacking in the West, which was the only thing that might have saved the Poles. As for the British, their army was still in the process of expanding, just as it had before World War I. The only real threat from Britain would have been the Royal Navy, and to send the Royal Navy into the North Sea, much less into the Baltic, to try and aid the Poles, would have been suicidal. And so the Poles were left to their fate. By the end of September, as mentioned, Poland had fallen. In October, Hitler made a peace offering. He said, okay, I'm done now. But he'd said that in 1936. He had said that in 1938. He had said that in March of 1939. And so, as much as some members of the British cabinet, including the Prime Minister himself, Neville Chamberlain, but also Lord Halifax, wanted to try and come to an understanding with Hitler, public opinion in Great Britain by this time had turned decisively against any kind of appeasement. And so Hitler's peace offering in October 1939 went unanswered. Hitler immediately ordered an invasion of the West. His generals were concerned, number one, that their forces were not ready. They had to take some time to rebuild, and more importantly, to digest the lessons of Blitzkrieg. As I mentioned to you, it didn't go quite according to the book, although the Polish campaign looked on paper like, wow, greased lightning. In fact, there were a number of glitches. And the German army wanted time, the professionals wanted time to incorporate those lessons into their training and so on before they took on what they considered to be far more formidable forces in the West. And so the German high command kept coming up with all kinds of excuses to delay, until the weather got so bad by December that it was going to have to wait until spring. Hitler, meanwhile, was pushing. As far as Joseph Stalin was concerned, as I mentioned, he was very, very worried that the Germans would, in fact, renege on their agreement, and so he moved very quickly to collect on the other aspects, the territorial aspects of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Specifically, he made demands on Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, demanding that they allow Russian troops onto their soil, that they pledge not to allow their territory to be used as a staging area for an attack on the Soviet Union, and in the case of Finland, border rectification. The Finns had, of course, become independent in 1918, but they had been part of the Russian Empire for the previous century. That sort of, they also made some noises about this place called Bessarabia. Anybody know where Bessarabia is? Okay, it's now the Transnistria Republic. It's down in the border between Russia and Romania. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all tiny little Baltic republics, felt that they had no alternative but to knuckle under. And so they agreed to Stalin's terms. The Finns, on the other hand, stood fast and rejected the Russian ultimatum, which infuriated Stalin, of course, and led him, at the end of November 1939, to launch an attack on the Finns. Now, Finland here in the West, and in the United States in particular, was a very popular place. It was known as Honest Finland because it was the only country that had actually paid off its war debts after World War I. Most of the debts had been suspended in the 1930s as a result of the Depression. And so the Finns had a really good press here. and there was a great outpouring of support, at least on paper, for the Finns, and initially the Finns put up tremendous resistance. The Russian advance was stopped dead in its tracks and thrown back with heavy losses. Many people in the West, and also the Germans, thought that this was an indication of the disaster that had overtaken the Red Army during the purges, that Stalin had executed so many high-ranking officers in his campaign to root out potential traitors, that the Red Army was an amateur force altogether. That was not entirely true. It is true that the Russians did not put their first-line troops into the fight initially against the Finns. And the proof of this, by the way, is what's happening in the Far East. Many people don't realize that the Red Army had twice bloodied the noses of the Japanese along the Manchurian border. And so there was no question that there were good generals in the Russian army, above all Zhukov, that's where he cut his teeth. But also, there were also some interesting tactical innovations and technical innovations, including the G-34. So it wasn't that the Russian army was completely unhinged by the terror, but at least initially it appeared that way. Now, as the Russians began to reorganize and to throw more men into the fight, by March of 1940, as the snows began to melt, so too did Finnish resistance. In London, Winston Churchill, among others, who had been brought back as the First Lord of the Admiralty, was arguing to send a convoy all the way up around Norway and Sweden to Finland to help the Finns, because obviously you couldn't go through the Baltic. And there were actually plans being laid for this, but fortunately, and I say fortunately, the reason I should have done it, that the Finns gave up, and in March, mid-March, they agreed to Stalin's terms. Stalin, however, didn't chastened by this. He was surprised by the outpouring of support for the Finns, and as we'll see as we get toward the end of the war, he didn't forget that, even though the Finns joined with the Germans in their assault on Russia in the summer of 1941, that sort of thing. But it meant that the British and the French did not all of a sudden find themselves at war with both Germany and Russia in the spring of 1940. There were still only the Germans. The Italians had also sat out the first round. Some of you may recall they had done that in World War I as well. But as the spring moved on, the German invasion in the West became increasingly likely. The winter of 1939-1940 had been called the Phony War, as the French and the British hunkered down behind the Maginot Line. The headline writers dubbed it the Sitzkrieg, as opposed to the Blitzkrieg, and that sort of thing. But all of that was about to change. In April 1940, Germany occupied Denmark without a fight. The Danes chose not to oppose the German occupation outright, although they certainly did their best not to cooperate throughout the war, actually. And also, Norway was invaded and taken over by the Germans as well. This had to do with the fact that much of the Swedish iron and nickel that was vital to the German war effort was coming down the Norwegian coast from the mines up the top end of the Scandinavian peninsula. Sweden, of course, was carefully neutral, just as it had been in the First World War, and that sort of thing. But the real show, the main show, began on May the 10th, 1940, when the Germans unleashed their attack in the West against the French. Initially, it appeared as though the Germans were going to do the same thing that they had tried in the First World War. You may recall from last year we talked about the von Schlieffen Plan, a great flanking movement through Belgium, swinging down from the northern part of France and rolling up the French forces. This time, the Germans not only launched their attack into Belgium, but they also invaded the Netherlands. The Netherlands had been neutral in the First World War, But this time the Germans felt the need to invade both. And just as the British and French expected, and their whole plan of defense was to rush up into Belgium and to meet this great German wheeling motion and try to keep it away from northern France. The Maginot Line unfortunately stopped. Not even at the Belgian border, it actually stopped a little bit before that because of some place called the Ardennes, which was a mountainous and forested area which the Western Allies believed that the Germans could not use as an avenue of attack because it was too, well, it looks like this, okay? And the Blitzkrieg, which had happened in Poland, of course, as you know, Poland is built, it looks like a tabletop, basically. It's part of the Great North German Plain. That sort of thing. And so the Ardennes was assumed not to be usable for an attack. Well, the Germans, of course, had an idea up their sleeves. Hans Guderian and other young armored officers had convinced Hitler that the attack in the north would be a feint, and that while the Allies were focused on the assault on Belgium and the Netherlands and rushing their forces northward to meet it, the real attack would slip through the Ardennes and break across the Meuse near Sedan. And it took only 3 days for the Germans to get their forces through the Ardennes. If the British and French had been on their toes, these long German columns along these windy roads, just imagine, I mean, those of you who live on 88 or in some of these other, these German columns would have been perfect targets. But the British and French were concentrating on the attack from the north. Within 24 hours, the Germans crossed the river and were now racing towards the sea behind the entire BEF, British Expeditionary Force, and 100,000 or so French troops. It became immediately obvious to the commander of the British forces that this was a disaster. And even before he received full authorization from London, he had already begun to pull out and to race back towards the coast. Now, something else had happened, however, in England on that same day of May 10. With the attack in the west, Neville Chamberlain resigned. And the only person that Parliament could agree upon as the new Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. Churchill had a long and colorful career up to that point, but he'd been in the political wilderness for 10 years. At this point, his reputation soared because of his opposition to appeasement. But Churchill never earned the trust of most of his colleagues. He had started out life as a conservative. He had jumped over to the Liberal Party beginning of the 20th century and had served in Liberal cabinets. And then he had drifted back into the Conservative Party. So people didn't trust him. But they did recognize that he had the kind of character that was necessary to prosecute the war. And as the disaster continued to unfold in France, as the German armored columns raced to the Channel to try and cut off the British and French forces in Belgium and the Netherlands, or Belgium, it was Churchill's character that was more important than anything else at the moment. And historians love to talk about, do people make the times or do times make the people? But in the case of Winston Churchill in the summer of 1940, if ever there was a man or person who was in the right place at the right time, it was Churchill. Now, it is also true that the British people believed the history that they'd been taught in school. Now, we act in the present based on what we think about the past, right? That's how you live your life. If you don't, if you ignore the past, right, you're going to put your hand on the stove again, all right? Or in my case, put another bobby pin in one of those wall sockets. That was not great. And discovered that electricity is So, yeah, okay, that's it. And the British people had been taught for generations. They always lost the first round in a war. But that they hung on, and as the empire came to their aid, they would gradually rebuild, and they would win in the end. This was a story that they had internalized. And so even though as the situation turned darker and darker in those late weeks of May and early June, there was no sense of panic. There was no sense of we have to make peace, that sort of thing. And even as the BEF was leaving all of its trucks, its tanks, its heavy equipment on the beaches at Dunkirk, and the soldiers were wading out into ships, and then of course the miracle of the small ships, when the British called upon anyone who had a craft capable of making it across the channel, get here because we need you to ferry men from the beaches out to the larger ships that can't get close. This sort of thing. Out of the jaws of defeat came what Churchill called the miracle of Dunkirk. Virtually the whole BEF was saved. But, as I mentioned, all of their equipment was not. In addition to the 225 or 250,000 British troops, almost 100,000 French troops were taken off the beaches as well. And so the miracle of Dunkirk became this kind of moral victory. But you don't win wars with moral victories. There was no disguising the fact that Dunkirk had been a disaster. And indeed, once the Germans turned their attention back to the French and launched their offensives into the heart of France, it was all over in another 2 weeks. At one point, Churchill desperately offered the French the opportunity to join Britain and France together into a single nation, where they would all enjoy joint citizenship. That shows you how desperate he was to try and keep them in the war. But the French had had enough. Paris was declared an open city and occupied on the 14th of June, and by the 20th of June, the French were forced to ask for an armistice. Hitler insisted that it be signed in the same railway car that the armistice of World War I had been signed. The French had turned it into a little monument and what have you. And the campaign in the West was over. As a kind of side note, in the first week of June, Mussolini, fearing that the Germans were going to get everything, decided that he better get in if he wanted something. And so he declared war on France and Britain in the first week of June. And thus now Italy was joined at the hip with the Germans. But the real panic was in Moscow. Stalin's whole plan was based on the fact that the Germans would attack in the West and become bogged down, fighting the British and the French, and he would be able carefully to stay neutral vis-a-vis the agreement. And then, when they'd exhausted themselves, he would be able to step in. Well, the French collapsed in 6 weeks. Now he was facing a Germany that dominated the continent all the way from the Curzon line to the English Channel. This was not at all what he had planned. He immediately incorporated the 3 Baltic republics into the USSR, which the United States, by the way, never recognized. And that sort of thing, because he realized now that his bid to turn Germany westward might happen. The French had let him down. Okay? That sort of thing. What followed next, of course, after the Battle of France was the Battle of Britain. And here's where we see, for the first time, science really having an impact on the war with the British use of radar. It wasn't what radar did was allow the British to husband their resources, the few of the RAF, to the last minute. If they had had to keep their aircraft in the air on patrol, they would never have been able to be victorious in the Battle of Britain. The first battle fought entirely in the air. For 6 weeks, the Germans attempted to destroy the RAF on the ground and in the air. And by mid-September, they had caved. One of the more interesting aspects of aerial warfare was that in the interwar period, it was believed the bomber would always get through. And indeed, the bomber always did get through. But not enough of them, or more importantly, the losses that were suffered were too great to bear. And it was fairly quickly recognized that if you could shoot down about 10% of the incoming force on a regular basis, pretty soon the enemy's going to run out of planes, and pilots, and crews, and the demoralization of realizing that your buddies are disappearing at an alarming rate. There's some dispute about at what point the British and the Germans decided that it was okay to bomb each other's cities, but by mid-September, the Luftwaffe broke off combat with the RAF during daylight hours, and at nighttime, they couldn't hit anything except a city. And very quickly, the British discovered as well that they couldn't either. But that flying in daylight was simply not possible. That the anti-aircraft defenses of both sides at this point were such that daylight bombardment was simply not an effective strategy. But it moved that, what do you call that? It moved the piece a little bit farther to the notion that it's okay to bomb cities and people rather than military men or even military factories. Now, there were all kinds of justifications for it. We're bombing the factories, and if we happen to miss a little bit, we're going to destroy the electrical, the gas lines, the water lines, and that would just, that would render the plants unusable just as well. And there are lots of these arguments floating around, but certainly by 1942, the Allies had accepted that given the Blitz, which the Germans had inflicted upon London in the winter of 1940-41, that essentially the gloves were off. And that everybody was now a legitimate target. But the Germans were not able to invade. Britain hung on by her fingernails. Here in the United States, as you know, Franklin Roosevelt won a third term in November of 1940 and began doing everything he could to support the British. Those of us who are big Roosevelt fans have to admit that he bent the Constitution about as far as it would go in terms of executive orders and that sort of thing. But he also began to mobilize the United States, where people were now beginning to realize that this war was not going to remain confined to Europe. And so things such as repeal of neutrality acts, lend-lease, cash and carry, and above all, the reintroduction of the draft in peacetime here in the United States. In previous American history, the draft had only been introduced during wartime. And I think you probably already covered that, that sort of thing. But the winter of 1940-41 was dark days for the British. Meanwhile, in the East, as I mentioned, Stalin was doing everything he could to solidify his gains under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and Hitler, by December of 1940, had already lost interest in subduing Britain and had turned to Russia. The Nazi ideology, of course, was anti-Bolshevik, was also extremely anti-Semitic, and many Bolshevik leaders, including men or earlier Bolshevik leaders like Trotsky and others, were of Jewish extraction, although they were all apostates. And Nazi propaganda was very big on Jewish Bolshevism. Okay, that was two words that always came together, that sort of thing. And in June of 1941, the Germans launched an invasion of Russia. It was the largest land campaign in human history. It caught the Russians, if not by surprise. It certainly caught Stalin psychologically unprepared. He disappeared for almost 2 weeks. Khrushchev later said that he suffered a nervous breakdown. When he finally reappeared on a radio broadcast in the first week of July, he called upon the Russian people to defend Mother Russia, not Bolshevik Russia, not the revolution, but to defend Mother Russia. Initially, the German Blitzkrieg once again proved its worth. Armored forces racing ahead, but very quickly, the old problem of the ratio of force to space finally came into play. Poland had been a very small campaign. France had been a very small campaign. The vastness of Russia simply swallowed up the 3 million Axis soldiers who were launched into Russia in the summer of 1941. Churchill, of course, was ecstatic. He immediately went on to the floor of the House of Commons and promised the Russians whatever aid he would give them. People said, Winston, you're a Bolshevik hater. You wanted to strangle them in their crib in 1917. And he said, yes, and if Hitler invaded hell, I'd say something nice about the devil in the House of Commons, because it meant that the British were no longer alone. There was the side campaign in North Africa already going on, that sort of thing, but now the British had an ally. Didn't look like a very good one, though. At first, the Blitzkrieg scooped up hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners. Within the first 6 months of the war, this is December 1941, the Russians had lost more than 3 million men. Overall, more than 5.5 million Russian soldiers were captured by the Germans, and of those, more than 3 million died in German captivity. The Germans treated the Russians as less than human. The death rate, by the way, for British and American forces in the German prison camps was about 6 or 7%. Gives you some kind of an idea. But the most important thing about the attack of Germany on Russia was it now meant, frankly, that when the war was over, Russia would end up in control of Eastern Europe. Simple arithmetic is what Stalin called it. On the very day before Pearl Harbor, December 6, 1941, Anthony Eden was in Moscow negotiating with Stalin and trying to, Stalin said, well, we're going to draw the Polish border here. Eden said, we went to war to defend Poland, and that's not where the border was. And Stalin said, it's simple arithmetic. As a practical matter, the defeat of Germany would mean that Russian influence would be sucked in to Central Europe. Then, on the following day, as we mentioned, December 7th, 1941, as you know, the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had been watching the situation unfolding in Europe. They had already occupied French Indochina. They saw the American fleet, the Americans, as the only real opposition to their plan for seizing control of the natural resources that they needed. And so they launched their attack. This put Roosevelt in a real dilemma. Even before Pearl Harbor, the Americans and the British had already held secret talks in which the Americans had agreed that when the Americans finally got in the war, we would focus on a Europe-first strategy. Okay? It was assumed that there would be war both in the Pacific and the Atlantic, or in Europe, and the Americans would join the British in defeating the Germans first because they considered them to be the greater enemy. On December 8th, however, the American people were not mad at Germany. They were mad at Japan. And when Roosevelt goes before Congress and asks for a declaration of war, he doesn't ask for one against Germany. He asks for one against Japan, which is immediately granted, of course. But how's he going to get us into the European war? 3 days later, Hitler made his second great mistake. His first mistake was to attack the Soviet Union. His second mistake was to declare war on the United States. We don't know why he did it, but it certainly solved Roosevelt's dilemma. And it now aligned the great British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States against Germany. And in that kind of a war, the Germans could not possibly prevail. As I say, we don't know why Hitler did it. Some people seem to think that it was an attempt to get the Japanese to join the war against Russia. They had remained carefully neutral. despite the anti-Comintern pact we talked about, the Pact of Steel, that sort of thing, they actually had a non-aggression pact with the Russians from the summer, April 1941. And so some people think that Hitler did this in hopes that the Japanese would then declare war on Russia and attack them in the Far East. The Japanese were having none of it, they had their own ideas. But as I say, it solved Roosevelt's problems. But it now brought together one of the most unlikely combinations ever seen. Britain and the United States, liberal, democratic, capitalist, now allied with the Soviet Union, communist, totalitarian, united by a common enemy, the Germans. And so long as the Germans continued to threaten the alliance, things would go fairly smoothly. But always in the back of everyone's mind, particularly Churchill's, was the question, what will Europe look like after the war? And so when we talk about the campaigns that unfolded in 1942 and 1943 and 1944, we always have to keep in mind what all three of the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, were thinking about in terms of the post-war situation. Because although there was an enormous amount of heavy fighting and massive casualties and this sort of thing, it was clear by the beginning of 1942 that at some point the Allies would prevail. Because Blitzkrieg had run its course. And by the summer of 1942, what we began to see, particularly in the East, was a rehash of the First World War, the continuous front. Although it was now set in motion, it was put on wheels. But it rolled back and forth across the Eastern Front. And it's difficult for us as Americans sometimes to realize just how gargantuan that struggle was. And in the East, it was a race war. It was a war in which Nazi ideology not only created the Holocaust, because of course several million Jews lived in the eastern portion, the western portions of Russia, and all of a sudden, as the German forces advanced, they had to deal with huge numbers of Jews. But it was also against the Slavs, who the German racial ideology also considered second-class citizens, as well as Bolsheviks. Commissars, for example, were shot out of hand. There would be no... So the war on the Eastern Front was far more a visceral struggle than it was in the West. But the casualty rates in both Western Europe and in Eastern Europe were horrific. The United States initially wanted to join the war as quickly as possible. Roosevelt promised a second front to Stalin in 1942. It didn't happen. The British, of course, were terrified of two things. One, a repeat of the First World War in northern France. And therefore, they consistently opposed any landings in northern France, any second front as Stalin understood it, because they were haunted, just as the French had been, by the slaughter in the First World War. The second was more political, and that was, in Winston Churchill's phrase, we want to make sure we shake hands with the Russians as far east as possible. Because it was immediately obvious, as I said, that the defeat of Germany would require, it would necessitate, the advance of the Russians into the heart of Europe. And getting them back out again was probably not going to be easy, as Stalin himself had made clear to Eden in December of 1941. In the Pacific, after running roughshod over badly coordinated and poorly supported forces of the Americans, the British, the Dutch, In the first 6 months of the war, the Japanese advance was finally checked at Midway, and the Japanese went over to the defensive to try and hold what they had captured. It took the United States about a year to get organized, to begin to wage war again. We'll talk about more about how that works in a minute. But it was an indication of the enormous logistical problems of the Pacific campaign, that it would take almost a year and a half before the Americans were able to turn their victory at Midway into any kind of really serious offensive action, except for the action in the Solomons. Excuse me, that's elsewhere, as I mentioned, this was a global conflict. There was warfare in the steppes of Russia. There was warfare in the desert of North Africa. With the final defeat of the Africa Corps at the beginning of 1943, there now was war in Italy in the summer of 1943. There will be, of course, D-Day and the Western invasion or the invasion of Western Europe in June of 1944. At sea, not only Midway in the Pacific, but of course the Battle of the Atlantic, one which had to be won before there could be a second front in France. We had to stop the U-boat menace. And here was the greatest strategic mistake that the Germans made. The U-boats were probably the one thing that would have given them a chance at some kind of negotiated settlement. But the Hitler and the German High Command were all land people. I mean, they were the Mackinder thesis crowd. You know, that the world island is the center of control, and that sort of thing. And they simply did not understand, as Germans did, the possibilities of strangling the Allies. And by the spring of 1943, June 1943, the U-boat menace had finally been corralled. And in doing so, by the way, science, once again, played a very critical part. As those huge radar stations of 1940 became smaller and smaller and smaller, it was capable of being put in an aircraft, and ultimately so small that you could put it in the fuse of an artillery shell. Those sorts of things. The anti-submarine warfare was a classic example of the application of science to a specific problem. And by the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had effectively been won by the Allies. And although the Germans would continue to use their submarines through the end of the war, as a practical matter, the lifelines to Britain were now open, and the preparations for D-Day could begin. Back in the Pacific, as we mentioned, two strategies emerged. One was an advance northward from Australia under Douglas MacArthur, and the other was the island hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, engineered by Chester Nimitz and the United States Navy. The United States Navy, during World War II, the British often felt that any resources that were sent to the Pacific were really the sort of the form of a bribe to keep the U.S. Navy in the war in Europe. Because they tended to see the war against Japan, of course, as a kind of private feud between the Navy and the Empire of Japan. The Navy had been humiliated for harbor, and that sort of thing. And although the Americans themselves had committed to a Europe-first strategy, as a practical matter, the resources did flow in both directions. And the problem for the Pacific was the enormous distances that had to be overcome, and before you could move on to the next level or to the next island chain and so on. And the kind of build-up. Here is where the exhibit upstairs really comes into play. It was the enormous industrial strength of the United States that made possible, ultimately, the Allied victory. By the spring, as we say, by the winter of 1943, the Germans had been driven out of North Africa. Mussolini had fallen. The southern half of Italy was now in the hands of the Allies, although they'd been stopped cold at Monte Cassino. The Japanese, as I say, were in a defensive crouch, and it was clear that the worst was over. As Churchill was to say after the North African campaign, it's not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, but it might well be the end of the beginning. And it meant that the questions about what would Europe look like after the war now came to be increasingly difficult, or came increasingly to the fore. And so in November of 1943, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin got together in, of all places, Tehran in Iran. You say, how did that get into it? Well, Iran, the Persian Gulf, was the primary route for Allied support, Lend-Lease support to Russia. And Iran had been occupied at the beginning of the war, or actually 1941, by the Russians and British. And Stalin was the head of the Red Army as well as the head of state, whereas Roosevelt and Churchill were political leaders. And Stalin said, I can't go anywhere that's not in the direct control of the Red Army because I have to be in touch with headquarters. It was also true that he'd only flown once in his life and got airsick, and he never flew again. And so anyway, Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt traveled all the way to Tehran in late November 1943. The Tehran Conference was by far the most successful of the three wartime conferences. Because the war was still going on. The Nazis had not been defeated. There was still going to be a lot of hard fighting. And so, relatively quickly, the big three came to a number of agreements. Number one, Germany would be dismembered this time around. No more, well, we'll cut them down to size. No, we're going to cut them apart. We're going to undo Bismarck. Everyone was agreed on that. The Russians would get their second front by May the 1st, 1944. Didn't quite make it, but we got pretty close. June 6, 1944. What would happen as the Allied armies converged on Germany from the east and west was put in the hands of something called the European Advisory Committee. It was to meet in London. It was to designate occupation zones. And this was done for very practical reasons. We didn't want our armies to be clashing with each other as they advanced. The big question at Tehran was Poland. There, the situation was had already been muddied by Katyn Forest. In July 1943, the Germans announced that they had found this massive grave of Polish officers who had been captured by the Russians in 1939 and had been executed in 1940. The Polish government in exile in London called on the International Red Cross to investigate. Stalin used that to break off relations with the Polish government, established his own Polish government, the Lublin Poles, as opposed to the London Poles. And so the question of who would govern Poland after the war was on the agenda, and even where Poland would be. Churchill made the point again, we went to war to protect Poland. So we can't very well bargain away the eastern half of Poland. But what he did say was that perhaps we could pick it up and move it 2 steps to the left and set it back down again. In other words, Poland would give up territory to Russia in the east and be compensated with territory from a dismembered Germany. And everybody seemed to think that that might work. Roosevelt let slip at one point that American troops, he did not envision American troops being in Europe for more than 2 years after the defeat of Germany. It's now 2018, we still have troops in Europe. Okay. Churchill was very concerned about that. Worse, at dinner one evening, Stalin suggested that the first thing they should do when they got to Germany was to take 50,000 members of the German officer corps out and shoot them. Roosevelt agreed. Churchill exploded. Said, you can't do this. And Franklin said, well, Winston would just settle 49,500. Churchill got up and left the room. He said, and Uncle Joe, which was Roosevelt's nickname for Stalin, Uncle Joe had to go out and put his arm around him. I say, we're just kidding. But denazification was also determined there. Stalin also agreed that once the war in Europe was over, he would join the war in the Pacific, but that he could do nothing until Germany was defeated. But Russia's resources were all focused on that sort of thing. So when people went home from Tehran in the first week of December 1943, everyone had reason to feel pretty good. Stalin had gotten pretty much everything he wanted to do a second firm date. He got Poland 2 steps to the left. He had that inkling that the Americans wouldn't be around for too very long. The British, on the other hand, felt that they had maintained their position, and Roosevelt felt that he had charmed Uncle Joe. Roosevelt had great confidence in his ability to charm the pants off people, and he could. He did in American politics. I got as far as he did. And he felt if he could just get close to Uncle Joe, everything would be fine. Well, in the spring of 1944, as we mentioned, the Americans now began to seriously accelerate their campaigns in the Pacific, the island hopping campaigns, as well as the advance back towards the Philippines coming up from the south. New aircraft were being designed and deployed, the B-29, which was specifically designed to fly from the Marianas all the way to Japan, because it was clearly obvious that the Japanese did not have the kind of anti-aircraft defenses that the Germans had put up in Europe. The Americans and the British had been bombing German cities, the Americans by day, the British by night, and they had begun literally to destroy German cities, but not German war production. I was talking to someone earlier. German war production continued to accelerate until the late fall of 1944, despite the enormous amount of resources that the West put in to the bombing campaign. And the Strategic Bombing Survey after the war demonstrated this, which is why the Air Force suppressed it for a number of years. But finally, on June 6, 1944, Stalin gets his second front. D-Day, the largest amphibious operation in history, the largest one there'll ever be. There will never be another one like it. Nuclear weapons make such a concentration of forces simply unthinkable if you want to do warhead sponge. That sort of thing. And so the British and the Americans began to advance from the west as the Russians now began to advance from the east, crossing over the Polish border in the summer of 1944, pulling up short in August to allow the Germans to destroy the Polish Home Army in the Warsaw Uprising, making it clear to the Poles that their literal survival as a people was now on the line. And that whatever the situation would be at the end of the war, they were going to have to come to grips with that. And if that meant Russian domination, then so be it. Because it was clear that they could be eliminated as a people if they did not cooperate. And the fate of Poland, again, becomes a critical problem for the Americans and the British in the West versus the Russians in the East. As the Americans and the British advanced towards the German frontier in the fall and winter of 1944, it's becoming increasingly clear that the war is going to be over sometime in 1945. And those agreements that had been worked out at Tehran were still pretty vague about specific issues. Yes, we want to dismember Germany, but what about reparations? Reparations have been the great bugbear of the interwar period. What should be the policy towards the liberated countries, much less the conquered countries? The Allies, the British and the Americans, the Western Allies, had already imposed their own form of rule on the southern half of Italy without any reference to the Russians in 1943. Stalin was furious. And when the Red Army began to fall into Eastern Europe in the summer of 1944, he returned the favor and shut out the British and the Americans as governments were reorganized in Bulgaria and Romania and in Poland and in Czechoslovakia. The Russians always arguing we have to have order in our rear areas in order to maintain supplies to the front. What was happening was what Stalin had said to Eden back in 1941. Each side will impose its own form of government on the peoples. Now, this led to the second great wartime conference at Yalta which has spawned a great mythology here in the West, that Roosevelt sold out Eastern Europe and that sort of thing. Well, Eastern Europe was not ours to sell out, folks. In February 1945, possession being 9/10 of the law, the Red Army occupied those territories. What we did do was get the Russians to sign something called the Declaration on Liberated Europe, which pledged the Allies to the earliest possible establishment through free elections, governments responsible to the will of the people. But it said earlier, all democratic elements would participate in this. And so what we began to see as the Russians moved forward was anybody they didn't want to participate in an election, they simply labeled as anti-democratic. And indeed, Admiral Leahy told Roosevelt when he got back from Yalta, look, the Russians can stretch this all the way from Yalta to Washington and not break it. And indeed, the enforcement clause was, if there's an issue, we will agree to have a commission to decide whether or not there is an issue. That sort of thing. But it was clear now that Germany was about to fail. And are we all still in favor of breaking up Germany? America, yes. Russia, yes. Britain, okay. What about reparations? America, yes, but we don't want any for ourselves. Russia, we want half of whatever we decide. The British, what Churchill was trying to play now, you understand that he's the weakest man at the table. The British had made the supreme effort in the Second World War. They mobilized a larger portion of their manpower in the war than any other country, percentage-wise. Even the Russians, the Germans, the Americans, what have you. It was the supreme effort. But it also paled in comparison to the resources available to the United States and the Soviet Union. And so Churchill's plan at Yalta was to delay everything as long as possible. And to allow, in some ways, the tensions to rebuild and to try to convince Franklin that Stalin was not to be trusted. A new government was re-established for Poland, a blending of the Lublin and the London Poles. And finally, perhaps the most important thing for Roosevelt, he finally got Stalin's agreement, on his idea for a replacement of the League of Nations, the United Nations. That term was already being used by the enemies against fascism at this point. The Russians had been the only people ever expelled from the League of Nations. When they attacked Finland in 1939, they got expelled from the League of Nations. And so Stalin was a little leery of any international organization. But Roosevelt understood, even before the atomic bomb itself, that this way of settling international disputes among the great powers was simply no longer possible. The game wasn't worth the candle. What you had to do to win was more expensive to your own society than anything else. You had to basically turn your entire country into a fortress. You had to sacrifice enormous resources, including blood and people. This simply could not go on. As we mentioned at the beginning, by the summer of 1943, people were dying at least 1 million a month around the world, and that doesn't even include the Holocaust. This was not, if we did not have some alternative to a return to good old-fashioned power politics, the next war would be the last one. And as I say, this is even before the atomic bomb was tested. Roosevelt knew of the project, but he didn't know whether it was going to work or not. He never did. He died on April 12th. The first bomb wasn't tested until July 16th, 1945. But he recognized that you can't do this anymore. There has to be some way to extend the cooperation between the East and the West, as it was now being called, after the cement of the alliance, i.e. Nazi Germany, had crumbled and disappeared. And his idea was the United Nations. And however much we may lament the failure of the United Nations to live up to Roosevelt's high expectations, we also have to admit that over the past 75 years it's done some good things. And when the United States and the Soviet Union, for example, during the Cold War, needed a way to get around something, to allow themselves to back off, the United Nations was always that last safety valve, and was used that way. Well, Roosevelt returns to the United States, and he's dead within 2 months. He's replaced by Harry Truman. Harry Truman was a senator from Missouri, who, when the Germans invaded Russia on June 22nd, 1941, was asked, well, what do we do, Senator? Do we support the Russians or the Germans? And Truman said, well, let's wait and see. If the Germans are winning, support the Russians. If the Russians are winning, support the Germans. That way, they'll kill off as many of both of them as possible. That man is now in the White House. And Stalin had not forgotten what Truman had said. And so you can see that there might be some issues there. Well, the war in Europe ground down in the spring of 1945. In March, the Allies crossed the Rhine, the Russians crossed the Vistula, and in April of 1945, Berlin fell. There was some debate about whether or not, Churchill was pushing. Far east as possible, far east as possible. Eisenhower said, no, I'm not going to risk the life of a single American soldier just so Mr. Churchill will have another poker chip at the bargaining table after the war. The Russians want to liberate Berlin, let them have it. It's in their zone, as the EAC is designed, and the Russians didn't liberate it or conquer it. It cost them 100,000 casualties to do so. By the first week of May, there was no Germany left. The German armies fighting the British and the Americans in the west, and the German armies fighting the Russians in the east were literally standing back to back along the Elbe River. And the end came very quickly. On May the 8th, actually on May the 7th, German leadership, Hitler by now was dead. Of course, he committed suicide on April 30th. The German leadership signed the Instrument of Surrender in Eisenhower's headquarters on May the 7th to take effect on May the 8th. The Russians said, no, you've got to come over to Berlin and sign one for us too. And so they did, but theirs didn't take hold until May the 9th. And so from the very moment of the end of the war in Europe, we couldn't decide what day it ended. In the West, we still celebrate on May 8th, although nobody really celebrates it anymore, but we still mark it on May the 8th. And in Russia, to this day, it is still celebrated on May 9th. This did not bode well for post-war cooperation. But Nazism and fascism had been slain in Europe. In the Pacific, the Americans were advancing island by island. In February 1945, 3 Marine divisions took the island of Iwo Jima, 3 miles by 5 miles, at the cost of 6,000 dead. 3 entire divisions rendered hors de combat. It was clear that this was not over. Stalin had promised that he would come into the war against the Japanese, and at Yalta he had said, I need 3 months before I can declare war on the Japanese. The Germans surrendered on May 8th. The Russians declared war on Japan on August 8th, 3 months to the day. But I'll leave that portion of the story to Dr. Lakeman. I hope I haven't missed parts of the war that you were interested in. If you want to tally up, what was it about the Allies that really accounts for their victory? Certainly there are a number of sort of mundane things. One of them was rational organization of production. German industrial production was a mess until Alfred Speer began to try to organize it. But here in the United States and also in Great Britain, rational organizational management techniques began from the very beginning. Certainly superior resources. standardized weapons, a few models that were easily adapted, B-17s, for example, actually first flew in 1935. By the end of the war, they were at what? Model G. Okay? Easy to adapt. Sherman tanks, easy to produce, and in outrageous numbers. And finally, the cooperation, particularly among Americans and British. Understand that British troops served under American command, and American troops served under British command. Now, there was not much in the way of direct military cooperation between the Russians and the West, but there was at least a common goal, and that was the destruction of Germany. And when it was achieved, the question now became, how do we reconstruct Europe? And that's for the next People's University after we finish talking about World War II. Thank you. Sorry, I ran over a little longer than I did last time, but I'll be happy to answer a couple of questions. If not, I know you've been sitting for an hour and a half, and I'll hang around for a little while and just talk. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I hope this was what you were looking for.